For as long as he could remember, Alex had lived in an orphanage with his younger sister, Emma. He didn't remember his parents, but occasionally he recalled a large house with beautiful paintings and a grand white piano in the living room. Alex even saw it in his dreams. When he talked about it to the caregivers, they just laughed at his imagination. "You couldn't have lived in such a rich house. It's just a dream," they said. "Poor orphans don't come to us from luxurious mansions. Children of wealthy parents are pampered and never leave the house without a bodyguard." Alex would only sigh when he heard these words, but the image of the bright, beautiful house stayed in his mind. Alex had another peculiar trait that set him apart from the other children. When he and Emma were brought to the orphanage, he was tightly holding a black violin case. He clung to it so fiercely that the caregivers barely managed to take it from him, as if Alex was afraid to sever the last thread connecting him to his past. The violin was quite ordinary, as was the case, and the orphanage workers tried in vain to find a note or anything that might help them locate the children's parents. Alex and Emma arrived at the orphanage dirty and covered in scratches. The caregivers assumed the children had gone through a lot before they arrived. At first, 6-year-old Alex was so scared that he hardly left his room and refused to talk to anyone. He often sat on the windowsill, as if waiting for someone to come for him. But when asked about his parents, "Did your parents hurt you?" a caregiver once asked him, but Alex only shook his head. "Then where did you get these bruises?" she inquired, but Alex simply shrugged, leaving everyone to wonder whether he had truly forgotten or just didn't want to talk. It was impossible to get any answers from him. His sister Emma, who was only 4, slept most of the time and wouldn't let anyone near her except for Alex. He spoon-fed her and told her fairy tales, stories he must have heard from their parents. Several months passed, and the caregivers gave up hope that Alex and Emma's parents would ever come for them. They had grown attached to the children, especially to Alex, who took out his violin every evening and played sad, beautiful melodies that amazed the caregivers. They were astonished that such a young boy could play with such mastery, and they often found themselves wiping away tears, touched by his music. One day, Alex's favorite caregiver, Lisa, asked him, "Who taught you to play the violin?" He admitted, "I don't remember." And it was the truth. Alex couldn't recall anything about his life before the orphanage. The trauma must have been so severe that his memory blocked out the past to avoid the pain. But playing the violin seemed to comfort him, offering a sense of security during difficult times. As the years passed, Alex grew up and continued to improve his skills, playing every evening. He and Emma gradually adjusted to life in the orphanage, but it wasn't always easy. Alex sometimes had conflicts with other kids who were jealous of the attention he received from the caregivers. They teased him and called him a sweet boy, but Alex endured their taunts, knowing that his violin was his only true friend that would never betray him. However, one day, one of the boys hid Alex's violin. That's when Alex lost his temper. No one had ever seen him in such a rage. He threw pillows and chairs, stomped his feet, and yelled loudly, scaring the other boys. The caregivers rushed in, trying to calm him down, but he wouldn't let anyone near him. Finally, he shouted, "Give me back my violin." Only then did the caregivers understand the reason behind his outburst. Lisa stayed with Alex while the other women found the boy responsible, scolded him, and made him return the violin. After that, no one ever bothered Alex again. Life became more peaceful for Alex, but Emma often came to him for help. She lived in the girls' dormitory and was frequently teased. This upset her deeply, and she secretly dreamed of running away from the orphanage. However, Alex didn't agree with her plan. "Out there, we're not needed by anyone," he told her. "We're just children. Wait until I turn 18. Then I can live on my own and work, and I'll take you away from here." "But that's 8 whole years away," Emma cried. "I can't wait that long." Alex stroked her hair gently. "It's okay. You'll have to be patient. Maybe some nice people will adopt you." "Just me?" Emma asked fearfully. "What about you?" Alex shrugged. "I want our real parents to come for us." Emma began to cry, and Alex hugged her, whispering, "I do too." But deep down, he knew that was impossible. Though he didn't remember how, Alex was sure their parents were never coming back. As the years passed, life at the orphanage became increasingly difficult for Emma. The other girls still refused to accept her, mocking her curly hair, freckles, and awkward figure. Emma cried more often, struggled to sleep, and lost her appetite. Most days, she would hide in a quiet corner, clutching her favorite plush rabbit or reading books. One early morning, while Emma was asleep in the dormitory, her roommates played a cruel prank. They opened the window to let the cold air in, pulled off her blanket, and tied her to the bed with ropes made from an old sheet. Emma woke up shivering, unable to move. She desperately tried to free herself, but the knots were too tight. Emma soon caught a severe cold. At first, the caregivers didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just a minor illness. They isolated her from the other children and gave her warm drinks and herbal remedies to soothe her cough. But Emma's condition worsened, and when Lisa noticed her deteriorating health, she called a doctor. Emma was diagnosed with advanced pneumonia. Exposure to the cold and her weakened state from constant stress had taken a toll. The doctor said she needed serious medical treatment, which required money. When Alex found out, he was terrified. He had no idea how to help his sister and was afraid of losing the only person in the world who meant everything to him. I have to earn money for her treatment, but how? Alex thought. As usual, when overwhelmed, he took out his violin to calm down. Glancing at the instrument, an idea suddenly struck him. He ran to Lisa and shared his plan. Lisa listened carefully. "Yes, I think we can arrange that," she said thoughtfully. "But are you sure you're ready for this? There will be a lot of people." Alex nodded, determined. "I'll try. That's better than doing nothing." Moved by his courage, Lisa agreed. She promised to speak with the orphanage director and make the necessary arrangements. At first, the headmistress wasn't keen on the idea, but Lisa, being kind and persuasive, convinced her. "Fine," the headmistress said, "but you must take full responsibility for him." Lisa promised she would. The next morning, Lisa and Alex stood fully dressed at the orphanage entrance. Alex wore his best white shirt and black pants with suspenders. In his hands, he held the violin case. "Are you ready?" Lisa asked, adjusting her hat. Alex nodded firmly. They left the building and headed to the town's train station. The walk wasn't far, and along the way, Lisa told Alex riddles and shared stories about her own childhood in an orphanage, which surprised Alex. He hadn't known she was an orphan, too. "I wish I'd been born earlier. I would have adopted you," Alex said, smiling. Lisa laughed softly. "I would have been proud to be your daughter, Alex, but life had different plans." Finally, they reached the station. After buying tickets, they arrived at the central square. Alex took out his violin and began to play, while Lisa walked around the crowd, collecting donations. People stopped in their tracks to listen to the hauntingly beautiful melodies. As Alex played, the hat Lisa held gradually filled with coins and bills. 2 hours later, the hat was full, and Alex was exhausted. He decided to play one last song, choosing a gentle, calm melody. He closed his eyes and lost himself in the music. But when he opened his eyes, he noticed a tall man standing nearby, watching him intently. The man had dark hair streaked with gray, tanned skin and serious gray eyes. He looked strangely familiar. "Where did you learn that melody?" the man asked sternly. "Who taught you to play it?" Startled, Alex stammered, I don't remember." He felt panic rising in his chest, unsure why this man was asking him such questions. He looked around for Lisa, who was already rushing over. "Excuse me," Lisa said, breathless but firm. "You have no right to speak to this boy in such a way." "Boy?" the man repeated, his voice softening as he glanced between Lisa and Alex. "I thought—" He seemed at a loss for words. He stared at Alex with a mixture of disbelief and emotion. You look so much like—" He trailed off, unable to finish his sentence. "Like who?" Alex asked. His curiosity piqued, but the man didn't answer. Instead, Lisa quickly took Alex's hand and led him away. "We can't trust everyone," she whispered. "That man seemed suspicious." Alex protested as they made their way back to the station. "Lisa, I think he knew something about my parents. We should ask him." But Lisa shook her head. "No, Alex, it's too risky. Let's focus on getting your sister well." They boarded the train and soon returned to the orphanage, the bag of collected money in hand. Lisa was relieved, thinking they had enough for Emma's treatment, but Alex couldn't stop thinking about the man at the station. A few days later, Emma began her treatment, and to everyone's relief, she quickly recovered. The caregivers moved her to a different room where she wasn't teased, and she even made a new friend, a cheerful girl named Olivia. Alex was happy to see Emma smiling again, but his thoughts remained on the mysterious man at the station. One afternoon, Lisa knocked on Alex's door. "Alex, you've been called to the headmistress's office," she said. Everyone in the room looked at Alex in surprise. "Did he do something wrong?" someone asked. "No way, he's the goody-goody," another boy joked. "She probably wants to hear him play the violin," the others chimed in, laughing. Alex ignored the teasing and followed Lisa to the headmistress's office. As he entered, he gasped in shock. Sitting across from the headmistress was the same man from the station. "Please sit down, Alex," the headmistress said kindly. Alex sat, his heart racing, unsure of what was happening. "Alex," the headmistress continued, smiling, "meet Mr. Anderson. He's a well-known musician and respected music teacher. He's here because he wants to adopt you." Alex's eyes widened in disbelief. "Adopt me?" he whispered. "But what about my sister? I promised I'd never leave her behind." "Don't worry," the headmistress reassured him. "Mr. Anderson has agreed to adopt both of you." Alex felt a wave of relief wash over him. He looked at Mr. Anderson, his heart full of questions. Why us? Why now? What was the real reason behind this adoption? Alex couldn't believe what he had just heard. "Why us?" he asked softly, still processing the shock. Mr. Anderson hesitated for a moment, his eyes distant as though lost in his thoughts. "I just liked the way you played," he finally said, but Alex sensed there was more to the story. Something in Mr. Anderson's expression told him there was a mystery behind his words. A week later, dressed in their best clothes, Alex and Emma stood at the orphanage's entrance, waiting for Mr. Anderson to arrive. The two siblings clutched their small bags, holding all of their meager belongings. Exactly at 9 a.m., a car pulled up in front of the orphanage. Mr. Anderson stepped out, opened the car door for them, and effortlessly picked up their bags, placing them in the trunk. As the car began to drive away, Alex and Emma watched the orphanage shrink into the distance. They felt a strange mix of emotions, joy, fear, and uncertainty. Emma clutched her plush rabbit tightly, sighing softly. "I don't want to get out of the car, Alex. What if his house is scary? What if it's nothing like what we're used to?" she whispered, her voice filled with anxiety. Alex tried to reassure her, though he himself was unsure. "It'll be okay. We'll figure things out together." After a 2-hour drive, they arrived at a tall gate that led to a large, stone mansion surrounded by trees. The house had an imposing presence, and Emma shivered at the sight of it. "It looks so cold," she whispered. "Maybe we should go back." But Alex, determined to make the best of their new situation, squeezed her hand. "Let's give it a chance. We don't know what's ahead, but we're together, right?" They walked up the path, hand in hand, and when they reached the door, it opened to reveal a housekeeper who welcomed them. She led them into the grand living room, and as Alex glanced around, he froze in disbelief. There, in the middle of the room, was a grand piano, just like in his dream. But instead of being white, the piano was black, and the house, though luxurious, felt more unfamiliar than comforting. "Please follow me," the housekeeper said. She showed them to their rooms. Alex received a spacious room with a view of the garden, while Emma's room was smaller, with a window overlooking the distant mountains. "My name is Mrs. Davis. I'll be taking care of you while Mr. Anderson is away. If you need anything, come to me." After settling into his room, Alex carefully placed his violin on the table beside the bed and went downstairs. Emma hadn't come down yet. She was always slow, taking her time with everything. When he entered the kitchen, Alex was surprised to see another girl sitting there, about his age or slightly younger. She had straight chestnut hair with bangs and piercing gray eyes. "This is Cecilia, Mr. Anderson's daughter," Mrs. Davis introduced. "And this is Alex, his newly adopted son." "We're brother and sister now?" Alex exclaimed, amazed. Cecilia just nodded, her eyes observing him cautiously from beneath her bangs. She seemed unsure about the new additions to her life, but a slight glimmer of curiosity flashed in her expression. Emma arrived a moment later, shyly standing behind Alex. Cecilia's expression softened a little when she saw her, and for a brief moment there was a faint smile on her lips. Emma, eager to make a friend in this new house, looked at Cecilia with hopeful eyes, but remained too shy to speak first. The atmosphere was quiet and slightly tense as they ate. Mrs. Davis had prepared a delicious meal, far better than anything they had ever eaten at the orphanage. Even Emma, who usually had no appetite, ate everything on her plate, but Cecilia barely touched her food, pushing it around with her fork before silently leaving the table. Mrs. Davis sighed as she watched Cecilia walk away. "She's always like that," she said softly. "Her mother died when she was 5. Alex was about to ask something about Cecilia when music began to drift from the living room. Someone was playing the piano. "Who's playing?" Alex asked, enchanted by the beautiful melody. He realized it was a piece he had played on his violin before. "That's Cecilia," Mrs. Davis replied. "She's been playing the piano since she was 4. She's already a true virtuoso." "It's beautiful," Alex said quietly, and Emma nodded in agreement. After dinner, the siblings went to the living room, where Cecilia was playing. She hadn't noticed them come in. Her eyes were closed, fully immersed in the music. Alex watched her play, admiring her talent, and suddenly imagined the two of them performing together as a duet. But then he felt embarrassed by the thought. "She's the daughter of a rich man, and I'm just an orphan," he thought, sighing. That evening, Mrs. Davis knocked on Alex's door, informing him that Mr. Anderson was waiting for him in the living room. For some reason, Alex instinctively grabbed his violin and went downstairs. Mr. Anderson was sitting by the window. "Do you remember anything about your past?" he asked as Alex sat down. Alex shook his head. "No, nothing before I came to the orphanage." He paused, then added, "But I do remember a big house with paintings and a white grand piano." Mr. Way. Anderson's face tightened as if he had heard something shocking. He gasped but quickly composed himself. "Play that melody you played at the station for me," he said calmly. Alex took out his violin and began to play. As he finished, he noticed Cecilia had entered the room, quietly watching him. Mr. Anderson then spoke. "I want you and Cecilia to start practicing together. There's a talent contest in the spring, and I believe you two could win." From that moment on, Alex's dream of playing a duet with Cecilia began to come true. They practiced together every day, guided by Mr. Anderson, who occasionally offered advice but mostly observed in silence. As soon as practice was over, Cecilia would retreat to her room, and Alex rarely got the chance to speak with her. It was as if she had built a wall around herself, though Alex hoped that with time they could become closer. Meanwhile, Emma was growing restless in the mansion. Though she was no longer teased, she missed the companionship she had begun to build at the orphanage. She asked Alex repeatedly if he had become friends with Cecilia yet, but he always shook his head. One day, as Alex was walking in the garden, he noticed Cecilia sitting by a small pond feeding the fish. He cautiously approached her. "Do you feed them every day?" he asked. Cecilia nodded but didn't say anything. After a moment, she pointed to one of the fish. "That one's my favorite. His name is Mr. Wiggles." Alex smiled. "Hello, Mr. Wiggles," he said, making Cecilia's lips twitch into the faintest of smiles. They spent the rest of the afternoon by the pond, talking quietly and playing games. From that day forward, their bond grew stronger and Cecilia began to trust Alex more. As their friendship deepened, Alex knew that soon he could introduce her to Emma, and the three of them would finally become a family. The weeks flew by, and Alex and Cecilia continued their rehearsals for the talent contest. Their performances grew more refined, and Mr. Anderson seemed pleased with their progress. Finally, the day of the contest arrived. The two of them were incredibly nervous as they were driven into the city. Alex felt his knees shaking as they approached the contest venue. Cecilia, normally so composed, was pale with anxiety. They waited backstage as other performers went ahead of them. When their turn came, Alex took Cecilia's hand and led her to the stage. He wasn't as nervous as he expected. Performing at the train station had given him confidence. They took their positions, Alex with his violin and Cecilia at the piano. As they started playing, the music flowed beautifully, transporting the audience into a magical world. Alex was completely immersed in the melody, but suddenly he felt something was off. Cecilia had made a mistake. A wrong note jarred through the music, and then another. The audience shifted uncomfortably, pulled out of the spell the music had cast. Alex continued playing, finishing the piece, but he could feel the disappointment in the room. When they finished, there was applause, but not the thunderous ovation they had hoped for. Cecilia looked devastated, tears filling her eyes as they took their bow. She rushed off the stage, and Alex followed her, gently taking her hand. "It's okay, Cecilia," he whispered. "You did your best." Cecilia nodded silently, but Alex could see the pain in her expression. The weeks flew by, and Alex and Cecilia continued their rehearsals for the talent contest. Their performances grew more refined, and Mr. Anderson seemed pleased with their progress. Finally, the day of the contest arrived. The two of them were incredibly nervous as they were driven into the city. Alex felt his knees shaking as they approached the contest venue. Cecilia, normally so composed, was pale with anxiety. They waited backstage as other performers went ahead of them. When their turn came, Alex took Cecilia's hand and led her to the stage. He wasn't as nervous as he expected. Performing at the train station had given him confidence. They took their positions, Alex with his violin and Cecilia at the piano. As they started playing, the music flowed beautifully, transporting the audience into a magical world. Alex was completely immersed in the melody, but suddenly he felt something was off. Cecilia had made a mistake. A wrong note jarred through the music, and then another. The audience shifted uncomfortably, pulled out of the spell the music had cast. Alex continued playing, finishing the piece, but he could feel the disappointment in the room. When they finished, there was applause, but not the thunderous ovation they had hoped for. Cecilia looked devastated, tears filling her eyes as they took their bow. She rushed off the stage, and Alex followed her, gently taking her hand. "It's okay, Cecilia," he whispered. "You did your best." Cecilia nodded silently, but Alex could see the pain in her expression. One early morning, Alex was startled awake by frantic screams echoing through the house. He rushed out of his room to find Mrs. Davis standing in the hallway, looking pale and panicked. "Cecilia is gone," she yelled, her voice trembling with fear. Alex's heart raced as he sprinted toward Cecilia's room. When he arrived, he saw the bed neatly made, but there was no sign of her. Mr. Anderson was already there, staring at the empty room in shock, unsure of what to do. Without saying a word, Alex ran straight to the garden, a gut feeling telling him where she might be. He sprinted toward the small pond where they had spent time together, and as he approached, he heard soft splashing. His pulse quickened, and he ran even faster. When he reached the pond, he saw chestnut hair and delicate hands disappearing beneath the water's surface. Without hesitation, Alex jumped into the pond, not caring whether he could swim or not. He dived in and managed to grab Cecilia, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back up to the surface. They both coughed and sputtered as he dragged her to the shore, where the adults had already gathered. Mr. Anderson leaned over his daughter, his face pale and stricken with fear. "Everything's going to be all right," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion as Mrs. Davis wrapped Cecilia in a blanket. Emma, standing off to the side, sobbed quietly, terrified by what had just happened. Fortunately, Cecilia recovered quickly. By the next day, she was physically fine, but something had shifted in Mr. Anderson. He no longer left his daughter's side. He apologized to her for his harsh behavior and for prioritizing the competition over their relationship. Though Cecilia smiled at him, there was still a lingering sadness in her eyes. Alex hoped things would get better now, that Cecilia would begin to feel like her old self again. He wanted her to join him and Emma in their games, to laugh and smile as she once did. And slowly, things did begin to improve. One afternoon, Alex heard the familiar sound of the piano coming from the living room. Cecilia was playing again, and for the first time in a long while, her music sounded hopeful. Alex quietly entered the room and listened, a soft smile on his face. Cecilia noticed him, and for the first time in weeks, smiled back. Life in the mansion began to return to normal, but Alex still couldn't shake the mystery of his and Emma's past. One evening, while Mr. Anderson was sitting in the living room reading a book, Alex finally worked up the courage to approach him. "Mr. Anderson," Alex began, "I want to know more about my past. I feel like you know something, and I need to understand." Mr. Anderson removed his reading glasses and sighed heavily, clearly grappling with whether or not to share the truth. After a moment of silence, he finally spoke. "Yes, Alex, I do know something about your past, but I'm not sure if you're ready to hear it." "I'm ready," Alex said quickly, his voice filled with determination. "Please, I need to know." Mr. Anderson set his book aside and looked at Alex with a mixture of sorrow and reflection. All right, Alex, I'll tell you everything I know. Your mother was my student. Alex's eyes widened in disbelief. My mother? Yes, Mr. Anderson continued, his voice growing distant, as if recalling a long-lost memory. I was about 30 years old at the time, and I had been teaching music for several years. That's when I met your mother, Carmen. She was incredibly graceful, with long red hair and the same blue eyes that you have. Mr. Anderson paused for a moment, clearly caught up in the emotions of his memory. I fell in love with her almost immediately. She was a talented violinist, one of the best students I'd ever had. We spent a lot of time together. I took her to concerts, we went on trips, but to her, I was only a teacher. Nothing more. Alex listened intently, hanging on every word. Then she met your father, Mr. Anderson continued. He was a wealthy patron who loved music and art. They fell in love quickly, and not long after, they married and moved into the house you remember. That house wasn't just a dream, Alex, it was real. A lump formed in Alex's throat. But what happened to them? Where are they now? Mr. Anderson's expression darkened. There was a terrible car accident, he said softly. Your parents died that night, but you and Emma survived. Somehow you managed to escape the wreckage, but the trauma must have been too much for you. You blocked out everything, including the memory of your parents. Alex's heart sank. The revelation was overwhelming. His parents were gone, and all this time he had no memory of it. They're really gone? Alex asked, tears filling his eyes. Mr. Anderson nodded sadly. I'm so sorry, Alex. They were wonderful people. Your mother, Carmen, she was like no one else. I would give anything to bring them back. He hesitated before continuing. When I found out they had passed away, I felt like a part of me had died with them. And then I learned that you and Emma were missing. No one could find you. Alex was silent, struggling to process everything he had just learned. His mind was racing. I didn't know, he whispered. Mr. Anderson continued, his voice quieter now. I didn't recognize you at first when I saw you playing that melody at the train station. But I knew the piece. Your mother had composed it. It was one of her favorites, and I would recognize it anywhere. That's when I realized who you were. Alex was stunned. That melody was my mother's? He asked in disbelief. Yes, Mr. Anderson confirmed. It was her favorite. I hadn't heard it in years, but the moment you played it, I knew it had to be you. Tears began to fall down Alex's cheeks as the weight of his lost memories and his parents' fate crashed down on him. Mr. Anderson reached out and took Alex's hand. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't want to hurt you even more. But you've been through so much, and you deserve to know the truth. Alex nodded, wiping his tears. Thank you for telling me. I wish I could remember them. I'm sure their love for you is still inside you, Mr. Anderson said gently. And I have something that might help you remember them. He stood up and retrieved a small photo from a drawer. Handing it to Alex, he said, This is a picture of your parents. Your mother in her favorite red dress, and your father next to her. Alex stared at the photograph, his heart aching. His mother's eyes sparkled with the same blue as his own, and his father's warm smile made his heart twist. He carefully tucked the photo into his notebook, silently promising to show it to Emma when she was old enough to understand. From that day forward, the atmosphere in Mr. Anderson's mansion shifted. It felt warmer, more like a true home. The whole family gathered in the evenings, playing board games, reading aloud, or listening to Alex and Cecilia play music. Emma, of course, joined in every activity with boundless energy. As the months passed, Mr. Anderson often spoke to Alex and Cecilia about the future, encouraging them to apply to the music academy. Both were incredibly talented, and he was sure they had a bright future ahead. When the time finally came, Alex and Cecilia were accepted into the academy. They were the youngest musicians in the academy's orchestra, and their passion for music only grew stronger. Their bond also deepened, and soon after graduating, Alex proposed to Cecilia. Their wedding was a simple but joyful affair, filled with music and laughter. Cecilia looked like the most beautiful bride in the world, and Alex couldn't imagine being happier. 2 years after their wedding, they welcomed a baby boy into the world, naming him Alex Jr. He had his grandfather's curly hair and long, slender fingers, perfect for playing an instrument, just like his parents. Together, Alex and Cecilia traveled the world, performing music and building a life filled with love, passion, and harmony. And no matter where life took them, Alex always remembered the kindness of Mr. Anderson, the man who had not only saved him and his sister, but had also brought them a future full of hope.